morning, everyone. Welcome to the UBC Learning Circle, hosted by the Center for Excellence in Indigenous Health. I hope you all join me in welcoming Miranda Kelly and Danette Jubinville from the Doula Collective for our final session in the birthing series. In this session, we're going to explore the fourth trimester postpartum period and what that can look like for new parents and babies. We'll discuss postpartum recovery, breastfeeding, bonding, and a host of other topics, So before we begin, I would like to acknowledge that we are on the traditional, ancestral, unceded, and occupied territories of the Hunkaminam-speaking Musqueam people. I would also like to acknowledge the First Nations Health Authority for generously funding the UBC Learning Circle. As a quick reminder to everybody participating today, the topics we cover can sometimes be sensitive or emotionally triggering, and that topic is going to be different for everybody. So if that's you for today, please make sure that you're investing in some self-care. Talk to a friend, elder, counselor, family member, whatever it is that you need. Make sure that you're getting that today. So, introductions. My name is Cole. I'm from the Childbearing First Nation, and I'll be facilitating the session, kind of trying to keep up with these two as best I can. Other Learning Circle team members in the room today, but off camera, are Cynthia, our production coordinator. And for those of you following along on Zoom, if you'd like to introduce yourselves in the chat box, please feel free to do so. So I think that I've run out of gas, I've run out of steam. I'm going to pass it over to you to introduce yourselves and kind of get us started.
Great. I guess I'll go first. Sure. Hi, everyone. My name is Miranda Kelly. My ancestral name is Tilyen. I'm Stalo from Sawali First Nation, and I also have some mixed settler ancestry as well. I've been living here in Vancouver for about 10 years now. I'm a wife and a mother of two, and I'm birth and postpartum doula working with the Untitled Doula Collective, which Danette will speak to in a moment. So I've worked in Indigenous health in various roles for more than 10 years, and I'm relatively new to the doula work in the last year or so. And I'm really happy to be here today, so thanks for joining us.
Bonjour, Anine. My name is Danette Jubinville, and on my father's side, I'm Cree and Anishinaabe. Belong to the Seer family from the Pasqua First Nation. I'm also French on that side, and on my mom's side, I am German, Jewish, and Scottish. I was born and raised out here in Coast Salish territory, and I have a 3.5-year-old daughter named Keiston. I'm currently doing my PhD in the Faculty of Health Sciences at Simon Fraser University, and I a founding member of the Equatorial Indigenous Doula Collective, and I started working as a doula and around the time when we started the collective, which is 2015, and I got into this work following my own experience of pregnancy and childbirth, and feeling really passionate about improving those experiences for Indigenous people and families. So. Yeah.
Should we move on to talking about the collective?
Yeah, sure. Okay, so I'll introduce our collective. So Equatorial means family in the Squamish language, and that name was given to us by a Squamish elder after one of our other founding members, Jessica St. Jean from the Squamish Nation, was able to ask her nation to gift us with that name. And we feel like that name speaks really well to the philosophy behind our model of care, because from Indigenous perspectives, birth is tied to family, community, our nations at large, as well as the land and all of our other kinship relations. So our practice of doula care is really rooted in kinship that way. And so we came together under the shared vision to improve Indigenous people's experiences of childbirth, pregnancy, birth, and postpartum. So the ways that we do that are, one, through providing doula care to Indigenous families directly in the city here in Vancouver, as well as for families who might be traveling to Vancouver from outside of the city to receive perinatal healthcare services. And we also provide a community of support for Indigenous birth workers here in the city. So we've created sort of a community together where we share space and educate each other, support each other, uplift each other in our work. And one of the projects that we have right now on the go, that's been on the go for a while, is we're trying to create our own Indigenous specific model of doula training. So that's another piece that we're really passionate about, is education. And I guess maybe it's helpful if I back up a little and explain what a doula does, because maybe not everybody is super familiar with that term or that role. In Indigenous community settings all across Turtle Island, we've always had people who played this role of a doula, which is essentially somebody who helps throughout the childbearing continuum. And, like typically in our communities, so my great-great-grandmother, my grandmother's grandmother, was a midwife. She practiced until 1938 in our community, because that's when they opened the Fort Qu'Appelle Indian Hospital, and midwifery was essentially outlawed in our community. But when she was practicing, she would have attended births. She would have had helpers alongside her. They would have been people from within our family or extended family. And I just, talking to Indigenous people up here on the coast and in other places, I think that's a really a common way that birth work happened pre-contact. So, there were people within communities that were typically a part of families who worked as midwives or helpers to midwives. And those people typically held knowledge related to health and herbal medicine and body work and other healthcare practices that were essential for the well-being of our communities. And that knowledge was something that was passed intergenerationally. And so today, as Indigenous birth workers, we follow in those lineage traditions, and we're also informed by other forms of education that we have to do that work. So most of us in the collective have done different kinds of doula training, some Indigenous specific, some that's not, but we sort of bring, as Indigenous birth workers, we bring all of who we are to the work that we do. And, so that means our teachings, our time spent on land, our time spent with our elders, as well as our maybe more like science or healthcare backgrounds to our work to support families throughout the childbearing continuum. Do you want to add anything to that?
No, that was awesome.
Okay.
Yeah, that was great. And I guess if there's any questions about kind of more what is the scope of a doula or how do you become a doula, I guess we can address those as they come up.
Mm-hmm. I actually do have a question because we have the audience that's been we've been talking a lot about midwifery over the last couple sessions, and I'm a little bit fuzzy on what the difference is between a doula and a midwife. Could you maybe elucidate that for me? Thank
you. That's a really good question. So a doula is practices within a non-medical scope. So we don't do any diagnosing. We don't really give any clinical advice. We don't do any like hands-on checking or that kind of thing. We don't deliver babies or catch babies. But so doula care is typically thought of within the mainstream as like companionship type care. So, and that is a lot of what we do is just, providing like, empathetic listening, ensuring people feel heard, ensuring that people, have the space to think about what it is that they want in their birth experiences, and that we try to make sure that those things are honored. So some of our work relates to informed consent. So we'll work with our clients and families to build their like birth vision or birth plan or whatever that looks like for them. And we provide education and resources and sometimes access to different like healthcare providers within the local community. So like we resource families with other practitioners within the community that might be helpful to them. And then we'll provide, help and assistance with things like breastfeeding, nutrition, helping people to ensure that they get the adequate rest that they need by just like helping out with, light chores or holding baby, so that mom can go shower or nap or whatever that looks like. But a lot of it is related to that companionship piece. And then, in our role as Indigenous birth workers, sometimes we are asked to help or share from our own cultural backgrounds about different rituals or ceremonial practices that might support families to feel well during that time.
Mm-hmm. Okay, great. Thank you. It seems like it's a very intimate relationship that a doula builds up with families. Is that kind of correct? It seems like it's very intimate.
Yeah, it is.
Seems
We
like
get all up in that.
Cool. Very cool. Okay.
Yeah, for sure.
Yeah.
Awesome.
It requires trust. So because of that reason, I found it's been really important to work with families who want doula care, because sometimes we do get families who are looking for doulas kind of because somebody else said they should have one, like maybe
Right.
a social worker or a community support worker, or somebody was like, you're pregnant, you should have a doula, like let's get you one of these Indigenous doulas. And sometimes that works out just fine, but I found that people have to want that kind of help in order for a relationship of trust to be established. And so it definitely is a very intimate relationship.
Mm-hmm.
I would imagine it's very specific to the doula that's practicing as well. And what I mean by that is like, that the doula and the family would have to really kind of click. Do you know what I mean?
Totally.
Like, just because it seems like it's you couldn't just swap out doulas. Do you know what I mean?
Yeah, absolutely. So yeah, we all typically give free consultations to meet with families if they're interested in our
Right.
care, as like just to see on both of our ends if it's a good fit.
Match, yeah.
Yeah.
Okay.
And then we do typically work with backup doulas because life happens and we work on call. So, but we'll try to introduce that backup person
Right.
as soon as possible, so that in case that does happen, then that they're already an established.
Yeah, that there's a plan and that they've met them and they feel comfortable and all that sort of stuff.
Yeah.
Cool. Awesome.
Yeah. Like with my clients, I'll usually have a 1 hour consult meeting to kind of just see, do we click? Is this a good match? Is there that compatibility there? Because it is intimate. You are with someone in this very intimate, sacred time, both as a birth doula and a postpartum doula. So yeah, I'll have that initial visit, and then if I'm somebody's birth doula, we'll try to plan at least 2 prenatal visits. So we're having that chance to get to know each other before I'm walking into their birth space and seeing them in this really vulnerable, sacred space. So it is really important to have that element of trust and have that strong relationship. Because you're also going to be seeing someone who's, going through an emotional and physical event where they might be yelling, they might be swearing, or they might be really quiet and internal, or having a really intimate moment with their partner if their partner's there. So you're witnessing something that you wouldn't normally walk into or witness, just with, anyone that you've met a couple times.
Okay. We actually do have a question, and I'll read the question out and then we'll kind of see if we can kind of, answer it from here. Jessica says, I'm a Cree Métis midwife. We've just founded Alberta's first Indigenous midwifery collective.
Awesome.
Fantastic. Good for you. I'm trying to find ways that we can fund Indigenous doulas for our birthing people/families. This work deserves compensation, but our families cannot always pay. How are you funded? Any insights/promising funding models? I think that's a really
Such a good question.
Yeah. Do we want to try and tackle that right now?
I think we're laughing because this is a question that we ask ourselves all the time.
Right. Yeah.
And unfortunately, there's no easy answer to it. It's something that we're still kind of working through. And it does take a lot of conversations and putting ourselves out there and networking and talking to people, like trying to brainstorm ideas.
Mm.
So here in BC, there is Aboriginal Families Doula Grant Program through the BC Association of Aboriginal Friendship Centres. So a number of our clients are funded through that grant program. Currently, its model is not kind of a long-term sustainable funding model. So right now, they're only taking applications for clients up with due dates up until June of this year. So unfortunately, that's something that we can't necessarily rely on in the future as always being available to the families that we serve. But it is nice that it's open to, as far as I know, any families that identify as Indigenous. So you don't have to have status and you don't have to live on reserve to access that grant.
That's great.
As far as other provinces across Canada, I'm not sure if there's anything equivalent that exists.
No.
Do you know?
I don't know of any.
Yeah.
Mm.
We have recently heard about funding that's available under the umbrella of Jordan's Principle, which I believe that is across Canada. And if you're not familiar with that, there's I don't know if I'm the best person to try to tell this story, but there was a young boy named Jordan who had some high needs as far as medical care, and there was jurisdictional issues between who was basically going to pay for his care, whether it was going to be federal funding or provincial funding or band funding to provide the care that he needed. And he ended up dying kind of without this issue being resolved of who was going to pay for his care. And so this Jordan's Principle is the idea that every Indigenous child deserves care, and this jurisdictional issue of who's going to pay can't prevent that care from happening when that need is there.
Mm.
So the idea around Jordan's Principle covering doula care is that if this need is there, that it can be funded. So here in BC, there's a number to call that will reach the First Nations Health Authority in accessing that funding through Jordan's Principle. And again, unfortunately, I don't know what that looks like in other provinces as far as how to access funding.
Right.
And then, I mean, there is the option that if families are able to fund doula care for themselves, or to perhaps approach their band or tribal council if they have that affiliation to see if there's any funding that way. And then, do you want to speak to the partnership with St. Paul's?
Sure. Yeah. So so I'll just back up a little bit and explain that. So we, many of us in the collective haven't been able to access the Doulas for Aboriginal Families grant program just because it does have some eligibility requirements. Doulas have to be either DONA certified or members of the DSA.
Doula Services Association,
Yeah,
NBC.
those are the two, right?
Yeah.
To be able to access the grant, and not all of our doulas have those requirements. So from the beginning, since establishing our collective, we've been trying to find other funding models so that families can have access to doula care, and doulas can also be compensated because it is the reality that because of colonization, care work and women's work has been extremely devalued, and Indigenous people and Indigenous women especially have, their labor and care work has been exploited for a really long time. And so it is really important that this work is valued properly and compensated for. So that's one of our shared values in our work. But we also really believe that all families who want access to doula care should have it, because really this is our birthright. Like, we come from, these lineages of care. We always had this kind of care, and we should always have this kind of care. So that being said, a lot of the work because we have that shared value, a lot of the work that we've done since establishing the collective has been voluntary. We've asked when families couldn't afford to pay, which is, to be honest, most of the families that come through our collective cannot afford to pay for private health care. We've asked that if they can't provide anything else, that they would respect Indigenous economic practices of exchange. So whether that's offering tobacco or a blanket or medicine, something else that's culturally relevant for that person, because it is important that, in entering into that sort of intimate relationship with each other, that is honored as like a contract between two people that is rooted in a relationship of reciprocity, and that, there are mutual obligations to one another within that contract or that relationship. And so we've done that too. And over time, it's been okay because a lot of our doulas have been new, and we have, another part of our doula collective has been around mentorship. So learning from each other, and really fairly inexperienced doulas who feel called to this work getting more experience. And so for fairly inexperienced doulas, it's, it seems reasonable to do some work and not get paid for it. But I think for many of us, we found that, in serving families, it does cost us money too. Like, we have to pay hospital parking is outrageous in Vancouver, feeding ourselves. Some of us have children, so we need to pay for childcare when we're providing other families with care. So there are those kinds of hard costs. And then, of course, our time is valuable, and we feel that way. So it is a really tricky thing to navigate because, our families deserve care. And we also deserve to be paid for the care that we give. So we're trying to navigate those things together. And so the grant program has been one thing. Jordan's principal might be another thing. And then in the last year or 6 months, we've been able to establish a partnership with a local hospital, St. Paul's. It's through Providence Healthcare. And through their Indigenous health and wellness team, they were able to secure a $5,000 grant to provide access to our services through our collective for their Indigenous patients who are connected to St. Paul's and may not even be birthing at St. Paul's. They may elect home birth, but you do have to be connected to St. Paul's to access that grant. And so that's been awesome, but again, also a one-time grant, and it's new, so we're trying to use it so that we can have it again, and it is hard to do that. But we also do recommend that. I think part of this is education and families needing to understand what kind of services doulas can provide, how we can help to support healthy birth outcomes. And so sort of we do some advocacy around doula care and other types of perinatal private forms of healthcare, like pelvic floor health care is something that you can ask for at your baby shower or things like that. Just prioritizing really the way that you spend money for your health is another piece of it. So, but I wish that there was a very accessible grant that was long term, and that because I think it is a part of reconciliation. Our traditional midwifery care was outlawed. That was wrong, and that needs to be addressed now. And so I think that the government does have an obligation to make this kind of care accessible to our families. So that's some of the advocacy work that we have to do.
Particularly as it seems, just from kind of an outside perspective, that you get that the doula, particularly within your collective, acts as a receptacle, as a storage vessel for traditional knowledge of your communities and that traditional knowledge around birth, right? And around supporting birthing families. And I think particularly when you look at, your collective through that lens, and you can see a lot of the really strong value and the place that it has in the reconciliatory process. Jessica has a comment. Such great info. Thank you. I'd love to see a Canada-wide initiative / business case to support doula subsidies and Indigenous doula training. I'd love to connect / network. Is there a role for research on outcomes to support ongoing funding? Could that research be done in a decolonized way?
Maybe I should take that question. So, as I said, I'm a PhD student right now, and my PhD I just started in September. Is the purpose of the PhD, why I enrolled in it, is to do this research and to look at the role of Indigenous doulas in in improving the childbirth experiences of Indigenous families. And so hopefully that is, I'm committed to undertaking that work, because I agree that, we do, unfortunately, in public health, we need that kind of evidence to support what we ask for. And as colonized as that may be, it is kind of just the reality of the time that we're living in right now. So, I'm hoping to be a part of that, and I'm sure that there are other people around Canada doing that work right now too.
Cool, awesome. Thanks very much, Jessica, for the wonderful questions and contributions to the conversation. We really appreciated it. I think maybe we can move on to the next slide.
Sure.
I hope we can connect. Don't want to be reinventing the wheel out here.
Totally.
Yeah, absolutely. So I just wanted to shift gears a little bit now, and I wanted to share a creation story that's been shared with me. This is how it was told to me by Willie Charlie of Stalis. And so the story is, at the beginning of time, there was the sun and the moon, and they fell in love, but there was this great distance between them, and so they sent their love towards one another, and where it met in the middle is where the earth formed. And in the beginning of earth, there was this one life form that over time evolved into 5 different types of people. So there was the winged people that flew in the air, and the finned people that swam in the waters, and the rooted people that grew in the land and gave us plants, and the 4-legged people that walked on the earth, and the humans. And of the 5 types of people, we, the humans, were the weakest. And so the other peoples agreed that they were willing to sacrifice their lives for us to help us survive, to give us our food, to give us our shelter, our clothing, and our medicines. And what they asked in return is that we always give thanks for their sacrifices, and that we only take what we need, and that we give what we can to others who are in need. And I think this story, for me, has meaning in these traditional laws of how we conduct ourselves, and also thinking forward into the postpartum period, how we can humble ourselves, give thanks for what we have, obviously be grateful for this beautiful new baby that we have and this opportunity to be a life giver, but also recognize that it's okay to humble ourselves and ask for help, and to accept help from those around us, that it's okay in those moments to slow down and just really take the time to nourish ourselves, but really that being thankful for the help that's there and really accepting that help. And I'll get to sharing my story in a moment, but I feel like that's something that I really struggled with in my own postpartum period, and I do see it sometimes with the clients that I work with in their postpartum periods, being able to let go of some of the expectations that they have of themselves and just be willing to accept that help. So with that, I did want to pose a question that we'll come back to at the end of the presentation, but I wanted to pose a question of what teachings and traditions are being practiced in your communities with respect to childbearing, so whether it's in pregnancy or birth or the postpartum period. This is a question that I didn't really start thinking much about until I was pregnant myself, and I found that in my pregnancy I started wondering, a lot more about what are the teachings around staying well in pregnancy, around childbirth, and are there any ceremonies that I can practice or that I want to incorporate into my birth plan? And so I realized that there was some teachings that I'd kind of heard in passing throughout my life, but I became a lot more interested in trying to seek out those teachings during my pregnancy. And feeling a little bit like, who do I talk to? Where do I find this information? So I just wanted to pose this question now, and we can come back to it. But did you want to add anything at this point?
No, I would just share that I it was pregnant. I mean, I was already culturally connected prior to getting pregnant, but it was really, during my pregnancy that I felt a really strong desire to connect with those teachings around the childbearing continuum. And so I did offer tobacco to 2 different Indigenous doulas to support that journey for myself, and they helped me with that. And to me, that was a really important addition to the medical care that I was receiving from midwives, because they didn't have that kind of information, and I was looking for it. And I think a lot of people have that same story of like, maybe I didn't grow up with these teachings or traditions, but I really want my child to.
Mm-hmm. Yeah.
Mm-hmm. Yeah, so now I'll share a bit of my personal story. So as I mentioned, I'm a mother of two. I have a 5-year-old and a 1.5-year-old. And so it was when I was in my first pregnancy that I started giving more thought to what are these teachings. And I think I already kind of came in with the mindset of birth being a really sacred journey. And I really planned for my birth as an opportunity to connect to my ancestors and to have a spiritual experience. I really envisioned my birth being that. And I'm not going to get into my whole birth story, but I will say that it really did feel that way. I had a beautiful birth experience. And I do feel like I was really strong and connected in that moment in birthing my baby. So I imagined birth as this kind of ceremonial opening, and really, you really physically are opening for your baby to come out, whether that's a vaginal birth or a belly birth or surgery or C-section, however you want to call it. But I didn't take the next step of thinking about the closing and the postpartum period. And so in my tradition, when we gather, we open the gathering in a traditional way with an opening, whether that's a song or a prayer or both, but we have some kind of opening. And then we also close the gathering in a good way. And so I feel like the mistake that I made in my birth experience was that I prepared for the opening, but I didn't prepare for the closing period. So I'll share a bit now more about what my postpartum experience was like. So I think I had pretty unrealistic expectations of my body and my baby and myself. So I didn't expect that the recovery physically would take as long as it did. As I mentioned, I had a really great birth experience, and I wouldn't say that there was any trauma, physical or otherwise. It was a pretty straightforward, uncomplicated delivery. So I expected I would just kind of spring back into shape, and by 6 weeks postpartum, I'd be back to doing my fitness routine, and I'd be all good to go. And that just wasn't my reality. I felt pretty good for the first couple days. I had all those awesome hormones from birth coursing through my body, and I had all this energy, and I felt amazing, and I was ready to have another baby right away. And then about 3 days later, it hit me. I felt like I'd been hit by a bus, and every muscle in my body was sore. I had bruises. I didn't know where they came from. I was like, oh my goodness, what happened? And so I actually continued to have quite a bit of pain in my hips, in my back, in my neck, and that went on for months. And that totally threw me off. I went from being in this pregnancy and birth space of loving my body and feeling empowered and trusting my body to now feeling like, whose body is this? Is this my body now? Is this what I have to live with for the rest of my life? And feeling really exhausted. I wasn't sleeping well. I was in pain. And then I was also breastfeeding my baby. And even though, again, I thought, this is natural, I was lucky to see my mom breastfeed. So I saw my sisters breastfeed. So for me, it was kind of a normalized experience. And I just expected that this was something I was going to do and I would figure it out. It was harder than I expected. And, there's a lot of information out there on breastfeeding around like how often you should be feeding and how long feedings should last and positions and such. And I felt like it was all just incredibly overwhelming. As much as you can read about breastfeeding during pregnancy, it's a different thing entirely once you're there with your baby trying to do it. And I do feel like breastfeeding is a process that's kind of learned on the job. And it's also a relationship that needs to be built. So you have this baby with you, you're both learning at the same time. And I'd say even with my second, I expected, well, surely breastfeeding is going to be easier the second time around. But it wasn't. Even though I had breastfed before, my new baby hadn't. So she was still learning. And again, it's this relationship. This is a new person. I have to build this new relationship with her. And so we struggled through it. So I had, with my first, I had, I'd say a solid month of really struggling with breastfeeding. And if you add that up, nursing every couple hours over a 24-hour period for 4 weeks, that's like over 300 feedings where I was just like, ooh, I'm not looking forward to this. It's going to hurt. How am I going to fix this? I'm just dreading this feeding now and knowing that that's going to come every 2 hours or so. And that actually, it did affect the bonding process. As much as I completely fell in love with my baby, I also did start to feel some feelings of resentment with breastfeeding, feeling frustrated that I was the only one who could do this. My partner was standing there wanting to help, but he wasn't able to breastfeed this baby. I had to do it. And feeling like this baby was so demanding of me and I just wanted to get a break. So I had some feelings of resentment, but I also started to feel guilty for feeling that way because what I was hearing around me was, breastfeeding is this amazing bonding experience. You just lovingly look into your baby's eyes and you feel like a goddess and a superstar because you're making this amazing milk that's so good for your baby. And I didn't feel that way. I actually really didn't like breastfeeding at all. I was trying to push through and get to that point of loving it, but I did not. And so then I started feeling guilty that why am I not liking this? Am I just a bad mom? I just am not as connected to my baby as these other moms. I'm just kind of missing some kind of motherhood gene that's supposed to turn on and make me love this. So there was some feelings there of frustration and anger and guilt. And it did impact my relationship with my partner too, because I felt a lot of resentment towards him that, gosh, why can't he just do this? I already just went through this pregnancy and this childbirth, and why can't he do something? Why is it on me? I definitely was not taking care of my body nutritionally. I was often just forgetting to eat. I would sit down to nurse my baby and be sitting there for hours while she napped on my lap and just forget to eat or not have it available. So I wasn't eating that great. And we would end up just getting takeout food or ordering in delivery food because it was quick and all that we could handle at that point. But I wasn't really focusing on nourishing my body. Whereas in pregnancy, I was a lot more mindful of how I was nourishing my body because I was growing this baby. And for some reason, there was a disconnect there after the baby was born. Of course, I'm still nourishing this baby in the breast milk that I was making, but I wasn't thinking about that as much and really wasn't focusing on nourishing myself and recognizing that my body was going through a lot at that point and that it would have been really helpful to provide more nourishment. So I actually did end up being iron deficient, which I wasn't aware of for a while, and which was contributing to some of my fatigue that I was feeling on top of just not sleeping well because I had a newborn baby. So as I mentioned, I did try to return to activity way too early. I didn't totally know what to expect as far as postpartum bleeding after the baby's born. And that can actually be a good indicator to you if you are doing too much, because at 6 weeks postpartum, I was still having enough bleeding that it was really my body's way of telling me to slow down and rest. But I just kind of thought, I guess this is normal. And my midwives kind of said like, yeah, some people still have bleeding at 6 weeks postpartum. So I'm like, okay, I guess I'm fine to go ahead and start running again and going to mom and baby fitness classes because that's what we do. And I definitely launched in too early and too hard, trying to do too much. And it just continued with, contributing and making worse the pains that I was already having in my hips and my back. And it reached a point where I got an injury running and I just realized like, okay, whatever I'm doing is not going well and I really need to rethink this. And so I'm lucky that I live in Vancouver, where I have easy access to support through massage therapists and chiropractors and physiotherapists. So I did start to access that kind of support, but not until much later, more like probably about 6 months postpartum, I started looking for that kind of support, which did help over time. But another piece that kind of started to hit me more around that time, around 6 months postpartum, was feeling really isolated. I was used to working full time and being in an environment where I was interacting a lot with other people in my day-to-day life. And now here I was on maternity leave, at home with my baby, alone all day, sometimes going out to, these mom and baby groups or fitness classes, but not really feeling like I had connections there, and really missing a lot of my family and friends. So I didn't have family visiting every day. My friends were all still working. Not many of my friends at that time had children, so I didn't feel like I could really relate to a lot of the people in my life at that point. And I did start to feel quite isolated. And I was also struggling with the identity shift of becoming a mother. It took me actually a long time, months even, to get used to calling myself somebody's mom and to think of myself in that way. It felt foreign. It didn't feel like it just came naturally. And there was that identity shift again of being this highly independent, career-focused person to now being at home all day with a baby, and just using completely different parts of my brain and feeling disconnected from this person that I used to be and this person that I am now. And that again contributed more to some of these feelings of guilt, like, well, maybe I'm just not meant to be a mom. Maybe that's just not who I am. It's not in my character. And I also around that time started to feel a lot more anxiety, which at first I didn't recognize as anxiety. I thought like, oh, these are just like kind of normal things, like new parents worry about their baby and have these kinds of thoughts. And it took a long time for me to recognize that what I was experiencing was anxiety and that it was actually being disruptive to my day-to-day life. Another big change that happened around that time when my baby was about 8 months old is that we ended up having to move. The owners of our place that we were renting decided to put it on the market, so we had to move, and that was a really stressful time for me. And I really struggled with just the anxiety around, oh my gosh, how are we going to find a good place for us to live in this expensive city, and how are we going to make this work? So overall, I'd say well into like basically the whole first year, I really struggled. And I feel like if I had maybe spent some more time up front in those initial weeks postpartum, just really slowing down and setting some realistic expectations for myself and making sure that I had a really supportive network around me, that my postpartum year could have gone quite differently. But I reached that end of the year and was getting ready to transition back to work, and I was just feeling completely depleted. Thankfully, my baby did start sleeping through the night around 10 months. And so I feel like at that point, I started to have like a slow recovery of just being able to sleep through the night made a huge difference to how I was feeling. Even though returning to work, there was a lot of stress around setting up childcare and that sort of thing, I did actually feel a bit of relief going back to work, to be honest, to be connected to these other people in my life again and to reclaim that part of my identity as a person who works and has a career and can use my brain in that way. So there was a bit of, I think, healing and recovery at that point. I ended up breastfeeding her until she was 15 months, and I did find the first week that I had stopped breastfeeding, there was a huge hormonal shift, which was surprising and a difficult week. But after that, I did also feel like my body shifted and changed a little bit, and it helped me kind of feel like I was a bit more myself again. And then around 18 months, I finally started taking some iron supplements and shifting the way that I was eating a little bit. And I started seeing a personal trainer actually to start dealing with some of the physical issues that I was still having around hip pain and leg pain and back pain. And I found just with some simple core exercises that I was learning with my personal trainer, I was able to resolve a lot of those issues that I'd been dealing with for about a year and a half at that point. But I also mentioned that around that time, at about a year and a half after my baby was born, this is when people started asking me, when are you going to have another baby? And I was totally like not wanting to have that conversation and felt really frustrated when people would ask me that, because in my mind, like I was only now just starting to recover and I wasn't thinking about having another baby at that point at all. And sometimes, you know, the people around us forget or just don't realize that those comments that they make might not be helpful. And maybe it's something that, you know, we're not ready to talk about yet. So that in a nutshell was my personal story with my postpartum experience. I won't get into a lot of depth around what it was like going through my second, but I will say that just learning what I had from the first experience, I did approach things a lot differently, and we'll go on to talk about more of like the kind of supports that we can put in place for ourselves in preparing for the postpartum period. But first I wanted to ask Danette if you want to share anything.
Yeah, I mean, I could probably share for a long time as well my own story, but I just, I really just want to say that I resonate a lot with a lot of what Miranda shared about her own experience. I mean, my experience was a bit different because I was a single mom for most of my pregnancy and then during that time. But that's not to say that I didn't actually have a lot of help, including help from my daughter's dad. But I also really struggled. I mean, even now I'm actually just really starting to work on and learn how to ask for help. So this isn't something that I just wasn't able to do during that time. This is like my whole life. I never learned how to do this. And, you know, as a result and of not preparing properly or having, you know, it just mismatched expectations, I also struggled with feelings of isolation. I had a lot of challenges with breastfeeding to the point of actually needing to go get help at the Vancouver breastfeeding clinic. I had an extended bleeding period. I also had inadequate nutrition. I also was constantly forgetting to eat, and like my coffee or tea would always be perpetually cold. I was pretty much surviving off of like muffins and like microwaved pasta dishes, which is like just, you know, not at all what is needed during that time. I felt a lot of pressure to exercise. So a memory I have really clearly is that like 2 weeks postpartum, really feeling like I need to go for a big long walk. Like I have just been laying around for the last 2 weeks. Like, what am I doing? And I walked to Starbucks from my house, which was only about a kilometer away. And I was so sore in my pelvic floor when I got there. I just remember that. And I shouldn't have done that at all. Like I didn't need to feel guilty, but I did. And, you know, I also had a lot of sadness and grief that for me showed up when I was breastfeeding. Actually, I had a condition called D-MER where I would have a dopamine drop when I breastfed, and I would feel like really despair during that time. And I think that was just, you know, me not taking care of myself properly. Or, I mean, it's not all, like, I'm not the only one to blame. This is like a collective thing that we all need to take responsibility for. But I think that's really where my grief and sadness showed up. And I have a really clear memory of being like 5 days postpartum and just laying in bed with my baby, struggling to breastfeeding her, crying, feeling like I just want to be held. Like I had this really visceral need to be held. And, you know, I didn't have a partner, and you know, my mom was around. Like, of course I could have asked somebody to give me a hug, but I just wanted to be like held just as my baby was being held by me. And, you know, this really speaks to the mother-baby dyad, that inseparable connection between mom and baby. The two are really the same and need to be cared for the same during that period. And I was feeling that, but I didn't know it, and I didn't know what to call it. I didn't have the language or the education for it. And so now, like 3 years later, having an understanding of what is normal, what is physiologically normal, and, you know, what ways to support our physiology during that time, looking back and now even seeing like all of the ways that I was just adapting to things that were really, you know, wrong and not not how things should be. So even like the last few years, I've been living with pelvic floor issues. For example, like this feeling of if I jump or cough, like I feel like I need to pee. And it hasn't been until very recently where a midwife I've been learning from in one of my doula training courses had said, like, this is what women do. We have pain, or we have issues, or we have challenges, and we don't seek help. We just adapt to them as our new normal. And so for me, I've just been like, okay, like this is what everyone says. Oh, you had a baby. Now you have to just like pee. If you feel like you have to pee your pants, it's completely normal. Or for some people, it's poo your pants or whatever it is. Or you feel like your uterus is falling out of your pelvic floor, and people just accept that as like, this is just life now because I had a vaginal birth or whatever. I had a pregnancy, and it's totally not normal. And so it hasn't been until now, like 3.5 years later, where I have been receiving pelvic floor physiotherapy and actually addressing these things, and it's working and it's incredible. But it's just like, oh my gosh, I can't believe I spent the last few years of my life feeling so depleted and physically uncomfortable, and I just accepted that as like the way that things are, right, and should be. And I think there are so many other mothers and women and people who've been pregnant who are also accepting that, and it's not right. And so this is why we really need to talk about these things and talk about the ways that our communities traditionally supported these journeys, these ceremonies of birth, and going to the spiritual doorway and making the transition out of it into a new role as parents and mothers. Like, we had best practices for supporting lifelong wellness, during and following these experiences, and those things have been lost because of really intense colonization in our communities and residential school and for so many reasons. And now, especially women, we are bearing the burden of that loss in our physical bodies, and our minds and our spirits. So
yeah, before we move forward, I just wanted to thank you both very, very much for sharing that. I know it must be difficult to share those things and share those struggles, and I can't speak from a perspective of knowing, but relating to all of my older sisters that have children now, I remember them talking to me about kind of those feelings of embarrassment and guilt around sharing some of these emotions. So I just wanted to thank you both very much for being so vulnerable and open with me and with everyone. Appreciate it.
Thank you. It's not always easy to share our stories and to talk openly and honestly about everything that we're feeling after we give birth to a baby. Because a lot of the time, people want to come and celebrate with us and talk about how amazing it is to have this new baby. And yes, it is. But we also are dealing with a really big transition in life. So I wanted to speak to, how we honor this transition and recognizing the different seasons of life that we go through. And often as women, as mothers, as caregivers, and the different roles that we have in our community, we're used to taking care of others. That's a lot of what we do in the roles that we have. And sometimes it's hard for us to let go and take a break and embrace this season of receiving and having others take care of us. But, as Danette was saying, that's so important in that postpartum period when you just want someone to come and hold you and take care of you. Because when you birthed your baby, you were also born as a mother. And, you need someone to mother the mother, which is something that we can do as postpartum doulas, but we also really just need more of that built into our community structures. So I wanted to share this wheel. I hope people are able to read it, but I can also share the link. It's available online on the Pacific Postpartum Support Society website. So the Pacific Postpartum Support Society is based in Burnaby. They have a website with lots of great resources around basically mental health and mental wellness, going through pregnancy, childbirth, and the postpartum period. After I had my second baby, I had a much easier time for a number of reasons. And I developed a passion basically in thinking about how can we better support postpartum parents go through this transition phase and feel okay coming out the other side and come out, not feeling like they have lifelong issues that are going to impact their wellness. Having the opportunity to kind of compare and contrast my experiences between the first and the second, it was night and day. And some of it was, a lot of it was the, internal work that I did in preparing for having a second baby, but it was also having those structures in place to feel like I had a community around me to support me. So the Pacific Postpartum Support Society is one of the kind of resources in my community that I look to as a way, knowing that it was there and that it was accessible to me if I needed some extra support. So they do run local groups, like peer support groups. So if you live in the Lower Mainland area and you're interested, you can look into the groups that they offer. But I also wanted to mention that they have a telephone support line, and they also do provide text support. I think the texting support may only be once or twice a week, but the telephone line is available during the week, and you don't have to be local to call. And it is a great resource for anyone who just feels like they need to talk to someone. It's basically a peer support. So a lot of the people that you would end up talking to if you called this line are parents themselves who have struggled with postpartum depression or some perinatal mood disorder, and have experience as parents going through this transition. And so they have understanding of kind of where you might be coming from, and if you're experiencing any signs of postpartum depression or postpartum anxiety, recognizing that there's so many different factors in our life that can contribute. So looking at this wheel, like at the top, there's general losses, and it's something that we don't often talk about. We celebrate the addition of this new person into our family and into our lives and community, but we don't necessarily talk about what we're losing, and that we're letting go of this former self. If we haven't been parents before, then we're losing that. Or if we are parents, then letting go of that time that we had with just that child and or children that we have, and welcoming someone new. So there is this kind of grieving process that happens at the same time that you're celebrating this new person joining your family. And sometimes, like in my experience, feeling like a loss of identity, like you don't really know who you are anymore. You're kind of in this transition period of like, I don't feel like a parent yet. I'm still learning that role, but I also feel like I've lost this former self or this freedom that I had before I had this baby. And then, personality-wise, I definitely had really high expectations. I'm probably a type A person, so I expected that I was going to win at parenting somehow, and I didn't. I didn't win. You don't win at parenting. You just take it day by day. But I had these really incredibly unrealistic expectations of myself that I was just going to bounce back, and I was going to be taking my baby out to coffee shops and chilling and traveling and doing all these amazing things, and it didn't look like that. And so when reality didn't meet my expectations, I struggled. And then, looking at my social support network, I didn't have people stopping by every day and checking how I was and bringing me food. And I didn't know how to ask for that. There was certainly people in my life who would have helped had I known how to ask for help. And I tell my clients this all the time, like people want to help, but they don't always know how to help. So it's okay to be really specific and say, I need you to pick up diapers on the way over, or can you bring me some groceries? Or when you get here, can you do a load of laundry or hold my baby so that I can sleep for half an hour or take a shower? I didn't know how to ask for help, and I struggled because of it. So some of the psychodynamic, like we might be going through other stuff in our lives too. Just because we're having a baby doesn't mean that other things in our life don't happen. So sometimes we experience loss or lose a job, lose a family member, or in my case, I had to move. That was really stressful for me. Life keeps going on around us, and sometimes we have other things that we're dealing with as we're also going through this postpartum period, and that can be challenging too, especially if it's something that's unexpected that comes up, and now we have this new stress in our life to deal with. And then the physiological, there's certainly a lot going on. And we talked a lot about, some of the breastfeeding challenges or how you might feel physically, taking care of your nutrition, taking care of your pelvic floor health. So as you can see, there's just lots of elements that can contribute to how you experience your postpartum period, and whether it's something that's empowering for you or whether it's something that's challenging for you, or maybe a mix of both. So, in retrospect, I do think I struggled with postpartum depression and anxiety. I was never diagnosed. I think if I had, and I had accessed some support sooner, I think my recovery would have gone smoother for sure. I mentioned that, physically, I felt like I finally started recovering around 15 to 18 months. But mentally and emotionally, it was more like about 3 years that I finally started to feel ready to try to have another baby. And then I felt like I was no longer in this place of depletion, but actually kind of feeling like I was, taking care of myself. And so, I ended up doing training with the Pacific Postpartum Support Society after I had my second baby. She was about 5 months old when I took their training to become a volunteer telephone support worker. So I've volunteered with them, manning the lines when someone calls in and just talking through, what they're experiencing. And for me, it takes me back to that traditional law, the traditional teachings around, accepting that help, and then also when you have something to give, to offer that. So I had finally reached a place where I felt like I was okay and my family was okay, and I was now in a place where I could offer some of what I had learned to other parents to help them through their season of transition. The other thing that I wanted to mention around my own healing is when my youngest daughter was, I think, about 9 months old, my community hosted a baby honoring and welcoming ceremony. So this was just last summer, actually, last July. I was so excited when I found out that the ceremony was happening. And so my community is Sewali. It takes me about an hour and a half to get there from Vancouver, but I was like, doesn't matter what the nap schedule looks like that day, we are making sure we get out there for this ceremony. It just felt like it was something that I really needed. And of course, I wanted my daughter to feel that connection to where she comes from. So even though she was born in Vancouver, I wanted her to feel that connection to our home community. So when we showed up to the ceremony, they actually noticed my oldest daughter, my 5-year-old, was there too. She was 4 at the time. And they said, hey, she was actually never stood up and honored and welcomed to the community either. Do you want her to participate? And I was like, yeah, of course. So both of my daughters were able to participate in this baby welcoming ceremony. And during the ceremony, I just felt this heaviness just lift and just, oh my gosh, finally, I feel like that was just this extra step in my healing from that whole postpartum struggle, and just feeling like, okay, things are okay. We have this community around us. We have this support. There's people that we can ask for help. We are seen. We are heard. We're loved. We're welcomed. And so, yeah, I mean, I'm so glad that ceremony happened. It was actually only the second time that my community's had that ceremony in recent years, but it's something that's being reclaimed in my community, and I love that. It did so much for me. And then it was shortly after that I started working as a doula. And again, I just feel like I've come to this place of feeling like I have something to offer, and I really want to encourage new parents to be able to ask for help and accept that help in a way that I wasn't ready to when the first time I had a baby. Okay, so I wanted to share this beautiful photo. Alicia Monroe Photography, you can look it up, there's the website there. She posted these beautiful photos just a few months ago, I think, of Indigenous mothers breastfeeding their babies. And I think this is just so beautiful and such a beautiful way to reclaim this traditional parenting practice of breastfeeding, and to recognize, the strength and the beauty of Indigenous motherhood, and to recognize that, Again, it's okay to just slow down, take the time you need to get to know your baby, to nourish yourself as you're nourishing your baby. Take the time to grieve if you need to, of the things that you're letting go of as you become a parent. And, it's okay to humble yourself and to ask for help. Really, I found that there was a lot of work for me to do internally in preparing to become a parent the second time around. And doing that work really did make that transition easier. I definitely approached my expectations differently. So going into having my second baby, I wasn't expecting to hit up any mom and baby fitness classes or make sure I took the baby to baby story time at the library. Like, my goals were basically like, did I shower today? Awesome. That's great. Just having like one thing a day, my one thing. And if I got that done, I felt like it was a good, productive day. And also, I wanted to really emphasize that when you're investing in yourself, you're also investing in your family's wellness and your community's wellness. So it really is worth investing in yourself. And really, as we've talked about already, like pregnancy and birth and the postpartum period, it can be a really great time to learn and to connect or reconnect to your traditional teachings, and to reclaim those teachings and those practices. And at the same time, we don't need to feel guilty if we don't have those teachings, or we're not connected, or we're not practicing ceremonies or traditions. That's okay too. We all parent in different ways, and sometimes it's hard to bridge that gap if we do feel that disconnection, or maybe you're just not ready to try to pursue making that connection. I think we can all celebrate together when those traditions are reclaimed. So for me, when Sawali had that baby honoring ceremony, that was so powerful to me, and I feel like it was really healing for the whole community as well to have that. And recognizing, if there were new parents who weren't able to make it out to that ceremony, or who just didn't feel like they were in a place to participate, that's okay too. You don't have to participate, but I think we can all celebrate as a community when we see those traditions coming back and being practiced.
Oh, wow.
So this is another one of the photos in the series that Alicia Monroe posted. I encourage you to go check out her Facebook page or her website to see the whole series, because they're amazing, and it was hard to pick just a couple to include today. But I just love this. I love the normalizing of breastfeeding and of mothers being able to just sit together and be with one another. That peer support can make such a big difference. So yeah, I did want to talk now more about, what can partners and families and communities offer in terms of support to these new parents. And I think the first thing is to really thank and honor the life givers in our communities, to recognize this sacred time and what they're doing, their responsibility of carrying this life and bringing this life into the world, and just really having the respect and honoring of that role. And I think making space for these peer connections, being able to sit together in a circle and breastfeed together, or to be able to go to a community space and feel safe to breastfeed your baby in that space. As partners and as family members, as doulas, we always have more to learn about the postpartum recovery, how we can support that, how we can support breastfeeding and infant care. Learning more about what postpartum mood disorders look like, and what are the resources in your community that are available so you can help connect someone if they need some additional support. I think really protecting that space of the mother-baby dyad you were talking about. I think sometimes as excited aunties and visitors, we come into the house and we want to hold the baby. It's okay to not hold the baby and to let the mom hold the baby, and to not break that connection. I had one client who told me, like, as much as she was loving the support she was getting from her mom would kind of swoop in and help her every time the baby was crying. And when her mom left, she felt like she didn't know how to recognize her baby's cues or how to help when her baby was crying, because her mom had been swooping in and doing this for her. So she really actually kind of grieved having that time in the first few weeks to get to know her baby and gain that confidence as a parent that she knew her baby well enough to know how to respond. So sometimes as helpers, we might accidentally disrupt that process. But certainly we can come in and we can do lots around the house as a postpartum doula. Often I'm washing dishes, I'm preparing snacks, I'm doing laundry, I'm doing cleaning. I do often end up taking care of the baby for a little bit so that the mom can shower or take a nap. And then talking through some of the challenges around breastfeeding or infant care questions that they have, and also just holding that space for kind of talking through what this transition is like. I think sometimes parents actually find it really helpful to have a postpartum doula to talk to about some of the emotional struggles of being a parent. They don't necessarily feel like they can talk to their friends or family because their friends and family are expecting them to just be happy and be loving it. And I find sometimes that my clients actually feel more comfortable opening up to me about some of the challenges that they're feeling or some of the emotions of guilt or resentment or anxiety that they're feeling. They might not feel comfortable sharing that with some of the other people in their support network. So really listening and just validating those feelings can be really important. And then I think Sage was mentioning some breastfeeding support like peer groups and the Leche League. Those are great to look into. And also just in your community having breastfeeding friendly spaces. I love when I go into a place and feel like there's like a comfy chair for me to sit in or a quiet corner to sit in where I just feel fine to be able to nurse my baby there and not feel like I'm going to be asked to leave or cover up, and that people just, recognize it as a natural part of life. I'm feeding my baby. And I think what we can also do for one another is share our teachings. I was so grateful to anyone who shared teachings with me during my pregnancies in helping me prepare. So one of the things that I did differently my second time around is I did hire a postpartum doula. It was actually a member of our Equatorial collective. She was my postpartum doula. And she shared with me. She actually came to my house and helped me smudge before the birth. This was something that I wanted to do in preparation for the home birth that I was having. And then when she would come to me as my postpartum doula, she again would help me just kind of set that tone and set that space of a healing space, a sacred space to just rest and relax. And I feel like sometimes we impose on ourselves this idea that we have to be doing stuff and checking stuff off our to-do list. And it can be really helpful just to set that space of like, you don't have to be doing anything right now other than just resting. So yeah, I think that's mostly what I had to share. Do you have anything to add around how families and communities can support?
I guess just transitioning this conversation into thinking about how communities can support. I mentioned earlier that I've been learning from a midwife. Her name is Rochelle Garcia Saliga, and she runs an educational program through her business called Innate Traditions. And a concept that she's taught me is, she calls it evolutionary mismatch. So she explains this as the idea that as human beings, over the last 1,000 years, our basic physiological needs haven't changed, yet our contexts and the way that we live has changed radically. So thinking about, if we accept that and we know that, our needs during pregnancy, birth, and postpartum are not so different from our ancestors, 7 generations ago, how did they support those transitions and compared to how we do it now? And I think that there's a lot of wisdom there for us to learn from. And, part of it is if we accept that birth is a ceremony, which I think is an idea that a lot of Indigenous people share, then we think about how do we as communities typically approach ceremonies. I think that there's some basics there that we share, first of all, we prepare. So there's things that you do, there's things that you don't do. And that's maybe the pregnancy time. And I think right now there's a lot of emphasis on like what you don't do, but there's not a lot of teachings like that we're sharing with each other, supporting one another. And what do? You know, like our grannies say, walk every day, you know, like rest, feed yourself properly, eat organic whole foods that are, you know, grown in places where the soil is healthy, like all of those things, you know, spend time with your community, with your relatives, be kind to yourself, participate in your rituals and your ceremonies. Like, so we prepare for that ceremony. And then when we go into that ceremony in birth, it's like we're approaching this spiritual doorway between the two worlds. And it's a very precarious situation, you know, where we accept that there is a fluidity there between life and death, and that potentially that person may not come out the other side. So it is an extremely sacred ceremony. And so we approach it with that sense of reverence. And as communities, we hold that space like for that thing to happen, but we know that individual who's undertaking that journey has to do some of that themselves, and that we can't do it for them. But we do what we can for them. So, you know, we're there for them so that they don't have to do that by themselves. We pray for them, we sing for them, all of those things that we can do as communities for that person undertaking that journey. And then, like Miranda said, there's the closing of the ceremony and coming out the other side and transitioning, integrating that experience into your life, and knowing that your life will never be the same. And, you know, we have in our communities, we have practices around those things too, you know, like we feast, we recognize, we acknowledge those new roles. You know, we do a lot of things. We all do them differently in our different communities and our different families. But like, I think that way of approaching that time gives us a lot of cues as communities on the types of things that we can do. And so, like, yes, maybe parts of that journey is an individual thing, and we've been talking about some of the things that individuals need to consider, like learning how to ask for help. But all of that happens within the space of community, and you know, and our collectives, and even our ancestors are a part of that, and the land is a part of that. And so as communities, there are responsibilities that we all have to that ceremony. And so what are those responsibilities? You know, like what can we do to ensure that ceremony happens in a good way? So I think that's kind of the conversation that we want to have now. And I acknowledge that there's not a lot of time to have it, and it would be awesome if we were all together in person and we could talk about it, you know, for the next 2 months, because we could.
Mm-hmm.
But maybe if anybody wants to share, if I could open up for questions now.
Yeah.
Mm-hmm.
If anyone wants to share things that they're doing in their communities or in their own families, or even, you know, things that they recognize that they'd like to do, or questions that you have, yeah, make time for that now.
Mm-hmm.
Sure. I actually have a question, so I thought maybe I'd ask it. It's a little bit more general. It doesn't have to be with teachings and traditions practiced in the communities. While I'm doing that, please feel free to type up your responses, and we'll be sure to respond to them timely. My question, kind of, as I'm listening to you guys talk, and then thanks very much again for sharing everything that you did and all the knowledge that you shared. And I know it's really shifted my perspective in a lot of ways. And being reflective of it, like as a male in this space, my first thought is like, okay, are there resources, or is there anything that you can recommend, or do doulas work to kind of work with the fathers of the family and other family members on how to support? Because it seems like there's a lot that's going on, and I think if I'm reflecting, I would like to be a supportive and loving partner. And how do we kind of go about doing that? Would you guys recommend any resources, or do doulas kind of work with the family as a whole on how to support the mother?
Yeah. Okay. So, yeah, I say as a doula, definitely, I work with the whole family.
Yeah.
And most of the families, not all, but most of the families that I've supported have been families with partners.
Mm-hmm.
And yeah, sometimes, unfortunately, when I'm scheduling, like the times that they want me to come as their doula is when their partner's not home.
Right.
So I don't always get to see the partner, but we usually try to at least have the opportunity to meet once, like in the consult, to make sure that I'm a good match for the whole family.
Mm-hmm.
And yes, there's definitely ways to talk about like how the partner can support. the Pacific Postpartum Support Society has some resources for
Okay.
dads and partners on their website. Yeah, I mean, sometimes it's just a check-in and like, how are you doing? Like, this is your transition too. You're also becoming a parent. You know, how are you feeling? Yeah, I sometimes just have like, if I'm not seeing the partner, have text conversations around like, how are you doing? And, you know, sometimes I have dads ask me just like, how can I help? Like, how, I can't breastfeed and that's all this baby wants to do right now. So what should I be doing? And my usual response is like, everything else. But seriously, I mean, there's plenty of ways for partners to bond with baby other than breastfeeding. Like, you don't have to breastfeed your baby to bond with your baby. You can do skin to skin. That's great. You can bathe the baby. You can change diapers. You can hold and rock and bounce and walk. There's lots of things that you can do. And also maintaining the household. There's lots of things to do to keep the household functioning and help you know, the person who's recovering from giving birth to be able to just feel comfortable relaxing and not worrying about like this checklist in the back of the mind of like all these things that should be getting done, but I'm just laying here not doing it, to relieve some of that tension of just like, you know, everything else is under control and the only thing you need to think about is recovering.
Yeah, great. Thank you.
Yeah, your question is really important, and I think that you know, this conversation around how do dads or partners be involved and during this time, and recognizing their role as well as new fathers or new parents is so important, and I feel like it's a conversation that isn't actually happening enough. So we could probably spend a lot of time here, but I just want to say that you know, I also want to echo again some things I've recently learned from Rochelle. Is that one, like, fathers are also, you know, so we haven't used this word yet, but the first 40 days after baby is born, many cultures around the world, traditional peoples think of it as like a fourth trimester. So it is really still within that space of that of birth, and we're trying to sort of basically recreate the conditions of the womb for baby during that time to have a kind of a good, you know, slow, gradual, easeful transition into the physical world. And during this time is a crucial period of bonding between mom and baby, but also father and baby. And so, you know, fathers also bond with baby, and there's a physical piece of that, which is like the production of oxytocin, which is our love hormone, that is produced from that experience of bonding and skin to skin and closeness. And so for dads to have that experience of bonding, and because they have it in a different way than moms do, they actually need to physically be present during that time. And so it is actually really important that dads, you know, have that time away from work if they can, or we need to support families so that dads can be home during that time so that they can bond with baby and they can have that oxytocin production, and they can, and that physiological process that's really important to having for, you know, the health and well-being of that family can actually happen. And then that said, it's also really important that moms and birthing people have a larger support system beyond just their partner. Like that is not, you know, that person is also undergoing that transition alongside mom, and it is like totally unreasonable to expect that one person is going to be your village. And so like we absolutely need to recreate that village, and people need to have like lifeline, you know, like phone a friend lifelines that are beyond just their partner. So we do need to be checking up on new families and beyond just, you know, that first week or whatever. Like that for me, that was invaluable to me, that I had other mom friends who texted me every night at like 11 when I was awake breastfeeding, and like, how are you doing? Like that seriously got me through that time.
Oh, okay. We got quite a few comments here. I believe it's Maha. I'm sorry if I mispronounced your name. Thank you so much for sharing your knowledge and personal stories with us. I greatly appreciated this opportunity to learn and grow as an ally midwifery student. Oh, well, thanks very much for tuning in. Sheila, I would like to share that we do have a session in our prenatal group on traditional practices in our community. The practice traditions is a long list and some practice and some are learning. Okay, that would be awesome. Yeah, that's great, Sheila. If you want to share in the chat as well what that prenatal group is specifically, I'm sure lots of people would love to try and connect in any way. Marion, so very grateful to Miranda and Danette for all the wisdom and knowledge they shared today. So yeah, thanks very much again. You too. That was it's been really great. I think at this point I'm going to transition. I'm going to do a few plugs like I usually do for our upcoming sessions or for our end of the year session. But if you have anything else you want to share, please feel free to pop it in the chat box. We have one more session coming on later this week. We're going to bring some of the team in from the Silent Genomes Project to talk a little bit about what that project is and kind of how it impacts our communities, and hopefully maybe do a little bit of a survey thing. So if you're interested in doing that, please feel free to check in, because the Silent Genomes Project is really important, and I'm really excited for that session. Beyond that, we'll be finished for the year, and we'll be sure to produce another video, and there'll be some more communications going out about the end of the year and kind of what the fall will look like. So yeah, we're really excited for that, and hopefully you tune in. It looks like we kind of run out of steam for today for the chat box. So final comments again. Thank you both very much for coming in. I really appreciated this time. I feel like I learned a whole lot, and I need to find a quiet corner for me to go and process all the things that I've learned today. And I wanted to thank you all very much for following along at home. I hope that this was helpful and informative for you as well. Yeah, so until next time, take care. That's a wrap from all of us here. Bye-bye.